Paolo gave us an excellent introduction to Isabel Gowdie, and is a bodacious speaker. I, on the other hand, am not. I've also got down with a cold today, so sorry if I'm a bit nasal. So that said, I felt compelled to say something about how these books came not only into being, but also how they've now come to be printed for the first time. For I feel it's a truly lovely example of the manifestation of real magic in the modern world. And it's a story full of synchronicities and, frankly, freakish at times coincidences. I'm someone who likes to paint as complete a picture as possible, so I feel it's difficult for me to tell you about how this came about without first giving you a bit of my own background, as well as that of the book's creator, the artist John Upton. And here he is, and that picture says it all. He was a little low-key, he really was. I wish you to call him that. You see his little cheeky face? That's I think I've got another one. There we go. That's him when he was a bit older, not too long before he died. My back button. Okay, so my magical journey really started as a teenager at the beginning of the 1990s. My inner calling and innate love of nature naturally led me towards the magical paths of paganism and ritual magic. Feeling somewhat isolated, I decided to start a group in Peterborough. I used to leave notes in pagan-orientated books in the library before the internet. Probably a lot of you used to do that, the old ones anyway. So I used to do that in order to try and contact people locally who had similar interests. I joined the Pagan Federation, which back then the magazine was called The Wiccan. And I also placed an advert in a delightful homespun publication called The Gilded Pagans. I used to really like that. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I don't think they're going anymore. So in my naivety and youthful zeal, the question of initiation quickly became my all-consuming quest. I traipsed over to a pub moot at Cambridge a couple of times. I'd stalked people wearing pentagrams, because back then you didn't see them very often. And I'd also come across a traditional witchcraft group operating out of Swine's Head on the Lincolnshire coast. But no invitations for initiation seemed to be happening very fast. I mean, I was a late teenager, I was very impatient. So throughout this time, though, I'd managed to build up a small generic pagan and magical group in Peterborough, consisting of about half a dozen of us. And one person who came to the group was a lady called Iona, and to cut a long story short, by 1993, she was living in Scotland with John Upton. So one day I got a letter from her, and she said, Melissa, John Upton knew Dorian Valiente, and he'd been initiated her, so you can imagine me like, oh. So I'm like, I mean, my enthusiasm just went into overdrive. I mean, I found this really amazing. At that time, again, pre-internet age, there was only sort of a handful of known early Gardnerian initiates, and I got really excited. So it wasn't long before I drove up to the west coast of Scotland with my pagan boyfriend at the time, full of anticipation, eager to meet up with Iona again and be introduced to John Upton. Now, I was an exuberant young thing, and I'll always remember the first time I walked into John Upton's externally very normal looking council house in Dreghorn, and I was met with wafts of incense, huge gaudy mural of riotous colour that filled an entire wall, you'll see it in a minute, oversized canvases of naked women, landscapes, flowers hung everywhere. There were hanging mobiles, dangling glass witch balls, and there was a general slight Moroccan theme going on with faded rugs scattered about. And in the background, classical music was near constantly playing, apart from when we were watching Star Trek. Yeah, Trekkie, I'm afraid. Okay, so here's some pictures of his house. Oh, sorry, that's Dorian Valiente, I should have done that earlier. So this is so that was where there's John, and I mean, his whole entire house, I mean, he was known for being a mural artist. He always thought big. I mean, big was his thing. This was his ceiling here. He did this in the last few years of his life, a bit sort of like an Egyptian sort of tomb thing going on. This is the mural on the wall. That's the ceiling. Yeah, just random, artists. That's his bedroom, actually. I can't quite see. I think I like the little leopard there with the corner there. His eyebrows. Have you seen his eyebrows? I mean, they're a bit mad, aren't they? Now this object was particularly impressive to the young awakening self, me. It was a giant, it was maybe 5 foot tall, ceramic phallus with little winged doors in it, which you just about make out there. And these opened up and there was this fetus inside. Now this piece was given to John by the Brighton artist and sculptor Gary Turner. Interesting enough, Gary was also the lead singer of a band known as the Dodgems, and they had a hit with Lord Luke and His Missing in the late 70s.
Play it, come on, play it.
Okay, yeah, so I'm pretty sure that's one of Gary Turner's. So very quickly, John, who had a propensity to say things for good shock value, he started to entertain me with tales of Brighton in the 60s and 70s, where he was then the artist in residence at Sussex University. And one of the local creative linchpins. I mean, I was regaled with stories of psychedelic experiences, LSD trips, sexual experimentation, beatnik culture, stiff records, because he had a whole collection of them, and the Brighton Unicorn Bookshop. Okay, so some pictures here. Now this, it's not a great picture, this is probably one of John Upton's most famous, and Sussex University still have this. And this is called Christ's Entry into Brighton, and it's big. And in the middle here is Alistair Crowley, and there's Christine Keeler, and there's various people and faculty, people from the Sussex University at the time. So that's probably one of John Upton's well-known ones. This is just the detail on it. It's obviously Timothy Leary influence there. This is the Unicorn Bookshop. Now this is how it was. This is John Upton's stuff on the left here. And then it was reimagined a few years ago by a Brighton artist. I can't quite remember her name. So that's how it looks now, but it was inspired by the original one. Now the Unicorn Bookshop was really interesting. It was sort of very counterculture, place of a lot of different things going on there. Sadly, no more. Okay, so yeah, this is after it was reimagined a few years ago. I quite like they've put original 1960s mural art by John Upton, UK's first street artist. I'm sure he'd be very proud to know that was written about him. Oh, this is great. This is John Upton on the left in the 60s. This is his family. This was what he's wearing was known as his bear suit. I mean, he loved wearing odd clothes. So these were his children and his partner at the time, Carol. Now this isn't a great picture, but this is in one of the other books of shadows that I've got, and this is John at the back. And it was sort of like a boho kind of ritual, magical kind of group that they got together and did. I think Gary Turner's actually on here, but I'm not sure which one he is. But the lady on the left next to John, she's actually Jackie Keane, who was the wife of Jeff Keane, who was an experimental filmmaker. And I think they had an exhibition of his at the Tate Modern a few years ago after Jeff Keane died. Now, it was here that John met Doreen Valiente, and I think it was this group. So Doreen Valiente obviously lived, in Brighton. So, with her natural interest in counterculture and alternative thinking, she came along, and John told us it was here that she actually initiated him and Gary Turner into the craft, while perhaps a little oddly playing Tibetan Longhorn temple music. They're actually given this motley crew. Maybe that's not so surprising. Now, I don't know if we've got any initiatory lineage pedants in the audience. I'm not saying this would necessarily have been a Gardnerian initiation, but that's a debate I could happily have with you another time. So I've been fortunate enough actually to have had access to large chunks of Doreen's scrapbooks and diaries, and I spent a lot of time transcribing them into a digital, more easily searchable form. And by doing this, I can confidently tell you Doreen was always questing for the truth behind modern witchcraft, and whether it had really survived anywhere in some small forgotten pockets of the UK. For a while in the 1960s, Doreen worked with Roy Bowers, Robert Cochrane, and his traditional witchcraft, kind of the tubal cane. And she also went to great lengths to discover if Charles Cardell and his Coven of Atho had anything truly authentic behind them. I did an article on that some years ago. I mean, it was fascinating, the lengths she went to. She was sort of sneaking up and everything, and she was detailing it all in her diary. So it's not surprising that she would have attended this boho magical group, like literally on her own doorstep. Now, it's also important to understand that Doreen was far from a prolific initiator, and this is a really important point given what's to come later. So, back to John. Skipping forward now to the end of the 1970s, John Upton moved to Dreghorn in Ayrshire to become the nearby town of Irvine's resident artist. Now, he immediately started to be a character, with his innate bohemian, what I call lokiness. As an example, he very promptly organised a naked march through Irvine as a protest against the closure of a nearby nudist beach. Doesn't surprise you, this, does it? It was a few years later, in the 1980s, John was on a bus to Irvine and got chatting to a fellow passenger who with time revealed himself to have once been Gerald Gardner's secretary, friend, initiate, and for a while his right-hand man, and this was Charles Clark. Now, I've got a picture of Charles here. Now, I apologise for being rubbish, right? Now, I used to have a really good picture of Charles, and many years ago I put it in a really safe place. And we all know what happens. I've never discovered it again. And back then, when I knew Charles, we didn't have digital cameras and stuff. I've only got a few photos of him. So anyway, but that's Charles. So now at that time, Charles Clark was a virtually unknown yet really important character in the history of modern witchcraft. Now, you'd find no reference to him in any published books at that point, aside from one, in Aidan Kelly's 1991 book, Crafting the Art of Magic, and that reference doesn't actually name him. So, just to give you a bit of background about Charles, he first met Gerald Gardner in the early 1950s at a club associated with the Isle of Man publication Fate. This described itself as the journal of fantastical reality and covered things like parapsychology, witchcraft, and ufology. Now, at that time, there used to be a ferry that ran between the Isle of Man and the west coast of Scotland, right near to where Charles lived. And they would often use that to go and visit each other. Now, following the publication of Gardner's 1954 book, Witchcraft Today, Gerald asked Charles if he could help him by answering the deluge of mail inquiries he was receiving from people all over the world, thus leaving Gardner to the running of the museum. He also commissioned Charles to head up the Scottish Wicca, 1C, and to form covens in Scotland. In return, Gardner promised Charles a future stake in the Isle of Man Museum. Charged with this mission, Charles went on initiate various people. Probably the most notorious of those was Monique and Scotty Wilson. But then in the early 1960s, the Wilsons' behaviour triggered some scandalous newspaper reports, and Charles, regretting what he had done, tried to warn Gardner about them. It would appear Gardner was, ever swayed by a pretty lady, and appears to have ignored Charles's pleas, and also appears then to have changed his will. For upon his death, it was found that Gardner had left the museum to Monique and Scotty Wilson instead. Now, Charles, who I knew quite well, he was deeply hurt by the whole incident and withdrew from a lot of the politics involvement of the time. But I can tell you, right to the day he died, he always remained true to the 1C Wicca. He passed in 2002. So, jumping back now to the 1990s. So there I was up in Scotland for the first time to meet John Upton. And now you probably imagine my astonishment. I'd gone up there to meet him, this man who'd known Doreen Valiente. There I was, 20 years old or something like that. And so you can imagine my astonishment when John says, oh yeah, there's somebody else around the corner. It lived quite literally around the corner from John Upton, Charles Clark. So John said, yeah, let's go and see him. So I'm like beside myself. So I remember we went round there. Charles, very ordinary looking council bungalow, but he opened the door, let us in, and he told us his story. I think we obviously looked a bit shocked. I just couldn't believe it. This was, was just out there. And so then what he did is he started pulling out of his drawer letters from Doreen Valiente, Patricia Crowther, L. Ron Hubbard, quite a few other names. L. Ron Hubbard founded Scientology, to name but a few. There's a couple of pictures here, and it's 1964. This is one from Patricia to Charles. This is one from Doreen to Charles. So, and yeah, it's Philemon. So, anyway, we all went on then to be initiated by Charles. Let's cut a long story short. So, let's just stop here and think about this. So, John Upton had known and had initiation by Doreen Valiente. And then several years later, by complete coincidence, he'd unknowingly moved to the same village, quite literally around the corner from another very early Gardnerian initiate. Now, if there was ever a strong argument to be had about magical lineages and egregores, it's a pretty damn fine example of it. So returning now to these beautiful books, which, Eamon, you've done a fabulous job on them, I must say. I'm really impressed. So both Gardner and Charles had claimed a historical Scottish hereditary witchcraft connection. I mean, they all did that, but anyway. And John Upton, but I mean, it did propel John Upton to go, propelled by the amazing coincidence of it all. He set about looking into the historical Scottish witchcraft trials and creating his own books of shadows based upon them. So this Hellfire Books edition is actually composed of two of John Upton's creations. Now, you need to remember this was pre-internet age, so I remember John would go toing and froing to the local library, he'd order whatever books he could find, and there weren't really that many back then about the trials. And when the spirit so motivated him, he would sit there doodling away and painting these big books and interpreted them artistically in his own way. Now I'm sure you can appreciate this so far is a pretty amazing story of spookily bizarre synchronicities, and actually an excellent example, to quote Crowley, of a man who is doing his true will has the inertia of the universe to assist him. Another quote that springs to mind is, if you're a fatalist, is coincidences are fate's way of showing you're on the right path. I mean, I've been involved with various magical ritual and pagan groups for over 25 years now, and there is something to be said for knowing that you're on the right path and channeling your true, or some may call it divine will. And it really is when things effortlessly just fall into place. It's when the right book almost seems to fall off the shelf at you. And I feel this story doesn't quite end here with the synchronicity with John Upton and Charles and Doreen. But the journey these books then actually took to being published also needs to be mentioned. For I think it continues to whisper of some sort of magical egregore that continues to reach out, behind the scenes. Now, when John Upton died in 2005, he bequeathed me all of his artistic books of shadows, and I brought them back with me to England. Ever conscious that I had quite a special collection, but with not the faintest idea what to do with them. Thinking I'd probably just leave them to the Boscastle Witchcraft Museum upon my own demise. They actually sat in a box in my garage, gathering dust for years. Shame, I know. But it always niggled me they were hidden away like this, for they are the product of a truly intriguing set of circumstances. I'm not someone who has much in the way of money, and I couldn't even entertain the idea of fronting the cost of their publication. But they were through a different set of, again, those highly fatalistic occurrences, I think, based on a geographical move that I had made to the middle of England. I'd met and shown them to Eamon, the owner of the Hellfire Book Club, some years ago, but obviously the timing wasn't right. And last year, Eamon approached me to ask if he could publish them. However, we had a problem. We needed someone who really knew about the historical Scottish witchcraft trials to do an introduction with me. So two names came up. It was Emma Wilby and Dr. John Callow. And bizarrely, and I think as further clinching testament to the manifestation of real magic in our real modern world, one person, John Callow, lived literally in the next village to me, less than 2 miles away, having moved there just a year before. I feel that's pretty significant. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened had he lived, say, 200 miles away, but it just makes it all the more effortless and easier, that inertia of the universe thing. So the minute I found out that John lived so close, make no mistake, I knew beyond any doubt that a published version of these books wanted to manifest, and that it would happen. And here they are, 13 years later, an amusing number, after I inherited them. I think they are a beautiful example of outsider art, and importantly tell us that magic in symbolic and artistic form is just as, or perhaps even more powerful than chanting weird words, reciting a Enochian, waving magical tools in the air, or circumambulating around a temple. And really hope that for some of you, that magic calls and continues to unravel. Thank you.